What is a behavioral intervention? A behavioral intervention is any intervention that utilizes behavioral, cognitive, affective, or social processes to stimulate a change in an individual's or a group's behavior to promote their health and well-being. Behavioral intervention developers have an ambitious job to create the best possible behavioral interventions to achieve meaningful improvements in health and well-being. The NIH Stage Model is a conceptual framework that helps support this ambitious goal. It supports the development of maximally potent, maximally implementable interventions, those that achieve the greatest impact on health and well-being and that can be carried out with the greatest success in real-world settings. How can the NIH Stage Model help? Developing a behavioral intervention from idea to everyday use is not always simple or smooth, but the NIH Stage Model can help bring order to a complicated process. Let's say you see a significant public health problem. You think a behavioral intervention could help, and you know of a theory upon which the intervention can be based. So you develop that intervention. You confirm that it works in a controlled environment, that it has efficacy. You plan to confirm that it can also work in the real world, that it is effective. But what if it turns out it isn't effective? The theory the intervention is based on is solid, right? And if you're shown efficacy, it seems likely that the intervention has some value. So what have you missed? Unfortunately, more often than not, interventions that are efficacious fail to show effectiveness, and very frequently, no one knows why. The problem is that what may seem obvious about why or how the intervention works may not have been directly tested. In other words, we might not know that the intervention engages a specific mechanistic target, and whether the changes produced by engaging this target directly cause the desired changes in clinical outcome. Of course, you might be lucky enough to find that your intervention does have real-world effectiveness. In that case, how much time needs to be spent asking why? Practically speaking, if we have an intervention that is effective, how does knowing how or why it works help? Why not just start recommending its use? Or if we're sure that we already know how or why an intervention works, what is the benefit of testing this premise? Part of the answer has to do with components. Most behavioral interventions have multiple components to foster behavior change. But what are the key components or ingredients? If we don't know, then could we say the intervention is something of a black box? Suppose we discover a literal black box containing the multiple components of a behavioral intervention. We can list all the ingredients inside the black box, and we know that delivering it leads to new health-promoting behavior. However, we still have many questions. Are all the ingredients in the black box necessary? Which of the ingredients are critically responsible for the intervention to achieve its effects? How much can the mix of ingredients in the box be changed? Do the ingredients in the box need to be used in a particular order? Can we make the box smaller or lighter to decrease user burden? How do the ingredients in the black box make people change their behavior? If the ingredients are changed, can we make the intervention work better? What's the best way to deliver the box? Can anyone deliver the box at any time or place? And finally, if we hand over the box to someone else who will deliver the intervention, how can we make sure that the critical components are being delivered? Even if we know the components, we still need to determine which are essential for the success of the intervention and why. Answering these questions could help us make the intervention even more powerful and improve our ability to disseminate it with fidelity. Let's hear from Dr. Donald Edmondson, Associate Professor in the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Director of the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health at Columbia University Irving Medical Center.
When I think about the stage model and introducing it to an audience of junior scientists, I think of my own confusion early on as a young scientist, seeing these various problems and being aware of theories in the world of how I might create an intervention to address that problem, but feeling lost as to where to start. And what are the things that is there a checklist somewhere? Is there some kind of map to get me from where I am now with a desire to help and some knowledge about what might help to having an intervention that's out in the world and is effective and widely adopted? And the beauty of the stage model is that it lays out, no matter where you are in that process, what you should be doing to make sure that people further down the process can build on your work and to make sure that your work is optimally beneficial to society. It gives us guidelines for what should be included in our studies, who should be helping us to do our work, collaborators in community, collaborators in other disciplines. We can know what we don't yet know, and it gives us a sense of where to go and find it.
Defining interventions by their principles. To ask which components are essential and why is to develop interventions that are defined by their principles. Developing and testing hypotheses about which ingredients are essential for the intervention to work and how those ingredients work can help us better understand the principles governing the effects of the intervention. Understanding the principles governing the effects of the intervention helps us to know better under what circumstances and for whom the intervention should work, and just as importantly, where and for whom the intervention would not be effective. It should also help us know better how to adapt the intervention without compromising potency, enabling us to create interventions that fit seamlessly into a range of real-world settings. Let's hear from Dr. Shanita Hughes-Halbert, Vice Chair for Research, Professor in the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences, and Associate Director for Cancer Equity at the Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Southern California.
One of the questions that I've often received in doing work with community-based participatory research is, well, how do you know that the interventions that you're developing that have been developed to address specific concerns within this neighborhood or community, how do you know that it's going to work in another community, another neighborhood? The answer to that is, as we develop interventions that are theory-based and that target specific mechanisms, we have greater confidence that the interventions will be generalizable to other neighborhoods and communities. Therefore, it's really important for us to understand and develop interventions from focusing on the mechanisms versus and having that be the primary focus versus not using theory and not using a systematic approach for intervention development. By using a systematic approach for intervention development that targets specific interventions that are based on empirical findings showing that the mechanisms is related to the behavior, we have greater confidence that the work that we're doing within specific communities can be generalizable and scaled up and implemented across larger groups, larger communities, so that we can ultimately improve minority health and health disparities across the country.
In other words, knowing principles should help us maximize the potency and ease of implementation of interventions, in addition to helping personalize the interventions that we offer. By deliberately testing the principles by which an intervention works, we can more quickly design the most precise intervention that can make meaningful improvements in health and well-being. For these reasons, the NIH Stage Model takes a principle-driven approach to behavioral intervention development. Let's look at an example of the principle-driven approach in the development of a treatment for depression. Imagine that we have evidence from basic behavioral science research that one of the ingredients in the intervention operates by increasing behavioral activation and thereby decreasing negative affect. Another ingredient corrects attentional biases, and it is also believed to decrease negative affect. In this case, the principles or mechanisms that account for the intervention's ability to reduce depression are 1. Increasing behavioral activation, and/or 2. Correcting attentional biases. By identifying which components of the intervention are responsible for its effects, it is possible to enhance the overall potency of the intervention. It should also help to personalize the intervention. But potency and personalization are not the only benefits. Once we know the principles governing an intervention, that also helps us figure out ways to deliver the intervention with fidelity. In other words, by identifying the essential ingredients of an intervention and how and why they work, we are better equipped to make the intervention more implementable. Let's hear from Dr. Sona Demijian, professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience and director of the Renee Crown Wellness Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder.
In the study that we published in 2006, where we compared behavioral activation as an intervention for adults with major depression to cognitive therapy and antidepressant medication, one of the criticisms or challenges that was leveled against that study was that the cognitive therapy did not perform as well as expected because there were questions raised about whether or not the quality of the delivery was adequate. Now, that's a really interesting question to raise when you consider that the delivery of cognitive therapy in that study was done by PhD level, clinical psychologists who were trained by and supervised by literally world experts in cognitive therapy. And so what that question, I think, raises an important dilemma, which is if under those conditions, we are not seeing the kinds of effects that we would expect to see or want to see in terms of improvement in depression, then what does that say about the promise of that intervention delivered broadly? And so that, I think, was part of, those questions about, are there limits under which the dissemination potential of an intervention that has quite a few moving parts within it and has quite a high standard or process that's required to become trained and to be competent in its delivery? That was part of the impetus for the earlier research on behavioral activation, which really asked the question, when we look at this package of cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, what are the active ingredients? Can we parse this more complex and multifaceted intervention in a way that will let us really hone in on fewer moving parts? And that research identified this one little piece of this broader intervention that at the time people thought, well, that's not going to work. That's not going to work in terms of helping people recover from depression. It's not going to work in terms of helping them stay well over time. And yet what we found was that, again, this one little part of this overall package was not only necessary for change. The research that we have done has suggested that, in fact, it's also sufficient. Now, the benefit of that kind of use of experimental methods earlier in the research process to really hone in on that question of what are the active ingredients, what are the critical components, has a direct relationship to a commitment to reach and scale of the intervention, because what that has allowed us to do is to focus all of our energy on this one more precise and specific component of the intervention, and to then begin to examine, when we narrow in this way, when we specify in this way on the component that we know to be causally active, based on the research that we and others have done, who can deliver that intervention and how can it be delivered? And so when the linking of those early questions around what are the active ingredients has a direct connection to later research and critically informs the kind of potential, the kind of possibility that we see in terms of broad dissemination and implementation.
Studies have documented that getting interventions into real-world settings is challenging. Many behavioral interventions fall off an implementation cliff. They show efficacy in controlled clinical trials, but efficacy does not necessarily translate into real-world effectiveness, and interventions that aren't effective in the real world can't be implemented. There are many possible reasons an intervention may fall off the cliff. First, an intervention may be inherently difficult to deliver in the real world. Components of many behavioral interventions can be complicated, expensive, and/or time-consuming. They may demand more resources than are available in many settings. If behavioral intervention developers know the principles of an intervention, they can adapt or modify the intervention to put it into a more streamlined format for easier implementation. For example, putting interventions into a real-world friendly video format could reduce some of the burden on providers, or perhaps eliminating components after identifying and validating an intervention's essential ingredients can streamline the intervention without sacrificing potency. Let's hear from Dr. Linda M. Collins, Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Professor of Biostatistics in the School of Global Public Health at New York University.
An intervention can be dramatically, maximally potent, but if it never gets implemented anywhere because it's too expensive or too complex, its public health impact is going to be zero. One thing that I think we're missing in intervention science is this idea that we are accumulating knowledge and therefore interventions can improve over time. If you look over the past 20 years or 30 years, look at improvements in automobiles. Just think of the improvements in fuel efficiency in automobiles. Think of how much more phones can do than they used to be able to do. Think of how small your laptop is compared to the one you had 25 years ago, and yet how much more powerful it is. In all of these products, there have been incremental improvements over time that over 25 or 30 years accumulate hugely. I think we've been struggling to develop that in intervention science. And I think the reason is that we haven't been able to look inside the black box of our treatment packages. And now with most, I think there is a way to do that. And if people conduct more optimization trials, then we will develop this cumulative base of knowledge and that will inform us at every stage along the way in the NIH Stage Model.
There may also be challenges in training providers to deliver an intervention, especially at scale. Determining how to train providers in a scalable way is an important part of intervention development. An intervention developer who understands the principles of an intervention is well positioned to determine how best to train real-world providers to ensure that they retain knowledge and have the ability to sustain fidelity of delivery over time. To be sure that the training procedure results in both knowledge retention and fidelity of delivery, intervention developers must also test their hypothesis about the best approach to training. Let's hear from Dr. Lu Dong, Associate Behavioral Scientist at the RAND Corporation, and from Dr. Allison Harvey, Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Berkeley.
With the memory support intervention line of research, we have a really good example, I think. We had initially there was the intervention that was developed from cognitive science and cognitive and education literature. And there were 8 memory support strategies that were devised. And we trained the providers or therapists these 8 memory support strategies and just encourage them to use as many of them as possible and treat them pretty equally. I mean, there wasn't a lot of guidance about which one you should prioritize. which one is likely to be more effective than others. And then we have a brilliant graduate student, Garrett, who came along. And so he actually went back to stage 0, and he was looking at education literature and specifically about this idea about constructive learning. He went back to stage 0 and kind of came up with the really great idea that some of the memory support strategies seems to promote these kind of constructive learning activities better than others. And those may be the kind of strategies that we need to encourage therapists to use more than some of the others.
I agree that this Garrett Zeev coming in and taking on the question of which of the 8 memory support strategies are the most potent. The advantage being that if we could reduce the number of memory support strategies we're training providers in, it would simplify the intervention. As Lulu said, this has been really interesting and an unexpected turn back to, stage 0, and then kind of back again to stage 1. Now we're going, well, this memory support intervention was based on 8 memory supports. Now I think we're on safe ground to really think about just 4 memory supports. And then, of course, another angle that Garrett Zeev took was to look at our current training of providers in memory support. And he saw in the data that when we provide our training, the providers tend to be mainly doing the non-constructive memory supports. So this, I guess, is a stage 5 activity, or preparing for stage 5, preparing for dissemination and implementation, of going back to our training procedures and asking ourselves, okay, we're not going to be training in the non-constructive memory supports. We want to train in the constructive memory supports.
The NIH Stage Model embraces these key concepts. Potency and implementability are both needed for an intervention to have an impact. Determining the principles that govern an intervention is not a detour on the path to creating potent and implementable interventions. It is the path to creating potent and implementable interventions. It's best to study principles as early as possible in the intervention development process and as often as necessary. Implementability at scale is also best addressed as early as possible in the intervention development process and continued as necessary. Barriers to implementability are considered while an intervention is being developed and adapted, not as an afterthought in the intervention development process. In summary, defining an intervention by its principles makes sense because it allows you to focus on essential ingredients, better personalize interventions, and better train providers to maximize fidelity. Knowing principles allows for flexibility in intervention delivery as long as adherence to those principles is maintained. Let's hear from Dr. Allison Harvey and Dr. Lu Dong.
I think that the NIH Stage Model and the focus on mechanisms an essential part of the transdiagnostic approach, because many of the mechanisms that researchers are uncovering are common across problems, common across disorders. And so when we focus on mechanisms, we're not so interested anymore in specific diagnoses. And so that is an exciting aspect of the NIH Stage Model. It's really allowing us to develop these universal transdiagnostic interventions and then to consider how to take them out into the real world in that iterative and systematic way.
Yeah, I think if you're not focusing on, for example, if we're not focusing on mechanisms, then I think the state of the for example, psychological treatment is such that there is a, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy for each types of diagnoses. So that really increased the burden of the clinicians to having to learn a lot of treatments, and also patients to have to go through, because co-occurring or comorbidity is really common. So patients may have to go through multiple treatments. But a lot of these disorders co-occur because of a common underlying mechanism. So developing interventions that targets these mechanisms instead of sort of the diagnoses or manifestations of these kind of common causes is a more potentially effective and efficient way to improve, patient outcomes.
The memory support intervention is designed to be a universal intervention, an adjunctive intervention that can be added to any intervention, be it behavioral interventions, be it physician visits, nurse visits. There are just so many mental and physical health challenges that the memory support intervention can be added to. And we really purposefully began thinking of this, we called it transdiagnostic, so relevant across disorders and problems, and pan treatment, relevant across different kinds of treatments. And we paid a lot of attention to making sure that it didn't add to the length of the session at all, that it can really be infused in a seamless way into the existing session that is being delivered.
The next section of this video shows how these concepts unfold within the specific stages of the NIH Stage Model. Let's go back to the starting point and discuss the activities involved in intervention development from idea to implementation. You see a significant public health problem. You think a behavioral intervention could help, and you know of a theory upon which the intervention can be based. So you develop that intervention. You confirm that it works in a controlled environment, that it has efficacy. You plan to confirm that it can also work in the real world, that it is effective. The NIH Stage Model simply assigns terms to these activities so researchers can easily convey to each other what aspect of intervention development they are undertaking in any given research project. By encouraging intervention developers to explore the principles responsible for why their interventions work, the NIH Stage Model also encourages them to integrate basic research questions into any stage of the intervention development process, wherever it makes sense to do so. Thus, the NIH Stage Model integrates basic and applied research with each type of research informing the other. In this model, basic behavioral science that is relevant to the development of principle-driven behavioral interventions is called Stage 0 research. Stage 0 can precede intervention development, or it can be visited or revisited during intervention development. Basic behavioral science may include research that examines behavioral, cognitive, affective, or social principles, mechanisms, or processes, and it may include phenomena operating at any level of analysis: intrapersonal, interpersonal, social, institutional, economic, contextual, behavioral, psychological, neurobiological, or genetic. Let's hear from Dr. Samantha Ferris, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychology and Director of the Rutgers Emotion, Health, and Behavior Laboratory at Rutgers University.
The basic research that we do at Stage 0 is the most important aspect of intervention development, in my opinion. I spend most of my time doing Stage 0 research because it is so informative to when we get to any subsequent stages of the intervention development trajectory. If I were to sit down and want to develop a Stage 2 trial, I would want to know, what am I targeting specifically? Maybe I've identified a problem behavior as an outcome of interest, and maybe I have a few hypotheses about what interventions I'd like to try out. But when it's premature to come up with an intervention target. And so I maintain always a lot of flexibility and willingness to move within the stage model steps. I view it as, a really rigorous and systematic approach to developing intervention and doing so thoughtfully and patiently. And so if upon landing at a stage 2 trial, I would be doing so with clear evidence of what a mechanism that's maintaining the behavior is. I've well defined my mechanism of interest. I know how to measure it, ideally with a few different measurement tools. And I know that my intervention specifically can target those mechanisms of interest. A lot of the foundational basic research that I do can involve naturalistic assessment. It can involve survey data. It can involve experimental methods that involve manipulation of affect or physiological sensations in the lab in real time. And I think the great thing about the stage 0 is that there's really no limits to what you can do. And there's really no boundaries as to what sort of data could be used to inform not only your definition of a key target mechanism or under what conditions you might be able to change the behavior of interest.
When basic science questions are asked regarding principles, mechanisms, or processes of behavior change during the intervention development process, such research is not considered to be stage 0 research. Rather, such integrated basic and applied research is considered to be mechanism-focused intervention development, which can occur within any stage of the intervention development pipeline. Because the NIH Stage Model integrates basic and applied research, it may lead basic researchers and intervention developers to collaborate, and the lessons of real-world intervention development may in turn shape future basic research investigations. Let's walk through each of the stages more specifically. As we do, remember that the stages are conceptual, not chronological. Research can move through the stages in any order that makes sense and can revisit stages as needed. Stage 1. Stage 1 is the place where you create, modify, adapt, and pilot test an intervention for any reason, but in particular to make the intervention more potent and implementable in the real world. Because training materials can be essential to correctly administering the intervention, Stage 1 includes creating, modifying, and pilot testing real-world training materials. Let's hear from Dr. Sona Demijian.
When my colleague Cheryl Goodman and I, and also working with our colleague Arnie Beck in the Kaiser Permanente system, completed the first study that we did on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for women during pregnancy and early parenting, we were really excited about the results and the significant benefit that we saw in terms of relapse prevention for women in the postpartum period. So we went to the prenatal care clinics and said, we're super excited in the behavioral health clinics. Like, we're so excited about these research findings, look at this great paper that we published. And these are, members from within the system, and that work had been conducted within those prenatal care clinics, and said, let's talk about how to get providers in this setting training so that they can also deliver this approach. And that was, I would say, for me, one of the first places where I encountered that, kind of implementation limbo, which was essentially like the clinical setting saying, like, how low can you go in terms of the amount of training that is required? So I would say, well, we need 2 weeks. And they would say, how about 20 minutes? So, and that really, I think, raised, our awareness of the fact that these are serious resource constraints in most clinical settings, that the opportunity for ongoing professional development in the ways in which, we have mental health systems structured today are so limited. And so, at the same time, I was offering these what still is really considered in some ways the gold standard for training in mindfulness-based interventions, which is, a 5-day residential immersive training where, clinicians go away from their homes and their families and their workplaces and, immerse in both 5 days of didactic learning and most importantly, experiential practice and feedback. The opportunity, that's not an opportunity that most people in this world would have resources or allowances either in their workplace or in their home and family lives to be able to just pick up and do something like that. And so that really kind of initiated this question of how can we make this intervention, how can we make this learning accessible to people that doesn't require that level of intensive training and doesn't require that level of resources. And that was what was part of actually what launched us on the path of developing the Mindful Mood Balance and the Mindful Mood Balance for Moms, which are digital delivery platforms for the core skills of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, because the bar that was set in terms of the training that was needed, and again, the multiple, really multiple sets of skills that are required is really high. And so if that level of in-person training and in-person delivery of that intervention is the only path by which people will have access to the opportunity to learn and apply those skills, like that doesn't, get us very far in terms of holding that North Star of ensuring that all people who could benefit from these skills have an opportunity to learn them. So for me, the incorporation and the investigation of digital delivery methods is part of, as peer-to-peer methods, like part of building a broad and diverse ecosystem of behavioral interventions that are attuned to the realities of our world and the types of barriers and constraints that have limited people's access to what we know from science are skills that can have direct and enduring mental health benefits for people. I think the STAGE model can help us to hold a vision for a broad ecosystem of behavioral interventions, because I think one of the other aspects of the STAGE model is it reminds people of the importance of personalization or customization. It reminds the field that we really need to think about the individuals for whom these interventions are designed, and to ensure that the interventions are optimally matched to what individuals need.
You are likely to visit Stage 1 2 or more times, but it could pay off at later stages by enabling you to more successfully modify the intervention to increase its potency or make it more compatible with real-world demands without decreasing effect sizes. This approach will lay a stronger foundation for real-world effectiveness. So, take the time to develop a principle-driven intervention that is designed to engage precise mechanistic targets. And finally, show that the intervention actually has the desired impact upon those targets. Stage 1 description. Stage 1 includes all the work that goes into designing, adapting, Stage 1A, and pilot testing, Stage 1B, the efficacy of an intervention, with attention to the intervention's mechanism of behavior change. Stage 1 research can be conducted in any setting and with any providers, including research staff or individuals in the community. Stage 1 also includes developing and pilot testing methods and materials to train community providers to administer the intervention with fidelity to its principles. When making any modification to an intervention, it is considered to be Stage 1 research. Since modification and adaptation of an intervention occur only at Stage 1, the NIH Stage Model presumes outside of Stage 1 studies, the degree and type of flexibility of an intervention is defined within specified boundaries, and there are no plans to modify or adapt the intervention at Stages 2, 3, 4, or 5. Indeed, a true Stage 2, 3, 4, or 5 study strives to keep any deviation from the intervention that is being studied to an absolute minimum. Whenever planned deviation from the intervention is done, the study is considered to be a Stage 1 study. This approach feels very different from the more linear intervention development process that is so familiar from drug development trials. But behavioral interventions themselves are different. They are frequently complex, labor-intensive, and costly, with multiple components operating at the same time. Let's hear from Dr. Allison Harvey.
Clearly, it's complex to devise interventions, to work out what mechanisms to focus on. And the reality is, in any one behavior or condition we're interested in, there are going to be multiple mechanisms. And the NIH Stage Model helps with this complexity because we can begin by focusing on one mechanism or maybe more, but it encourages us to be very precise in stating the mechanism, in measuring the mechanism, in working out how to activate or deactivate the mechanism. Now, this might sound slow, but I actually think it's so much more efficient than the current reality, where we have, say, in the context of mental illness, multi-component behavioral interventions. We don't know which of the components are the most effective and the most potent. And we don't know which are most acceptable to providers and patients. So I think the NIH Stage Model helps us to break down the complexity.
To ensure the development of the best behavioral interventions, we need to know how they can be modified without compromising their effects. That requires very careful Stage 1 research, where an intervention is modified within the context of understanding how and why it works, and of testing whether this understanding is correct. If an intervention is modified within an efficacy trial or real-world effectiveness trial, we can't know what is being tested. Modification, adaptation, and refinement as part of Stage 1 work has paid off in important real-world intervention development, including Kathleen Carroll's web-based treatment to help people gain control over their drug or alcohol use, computer-based training for cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT-4CBT, and Michael Otto's ultra-brief treatment for panic disorder. Let's hear from Dr. Michael W. Otto, professor in the Department of Psychology and director of the Translational Research Program at the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders at Boston University.
CBT for panic disorder really got its legs underneath itself. There were a number of efficacious protocols out there, and then more attention started turning toward the core feature of the disorder, which I believe to be the fear of the anxiety sensations, which can be measured variably, but let's use the measure anxiety sensitivity. So if we say one thing that changes when you effectively treat panic disorder is you engage the fear of symptoms and anxiety sensitivity declines. Now, over time, there became a sort of schism between the initial protocols that developed a terrific way of engaging fears of anxiety sensations, anxiety sensitivity, which is interceptive exposure. But if you look back to the initial manuals, the manuals that really made itself out to dissemination, that part of treatment is relatively small and comes late. So if we keep a mechanistic focus, we could say, well, here's a terrific treatment with lots of different elements, yet the element that is most linked to reducing the core feature is relatively small and at the end of treatment. So given that, if we rewrite the manual, if we recursively go back to a previous stage and emphasize interceptive exposure, can we reduce the length of treatment, reduce the burden of care, and still get great outcomes? And indeed, that does seem the case. You can reduce the treatment down to 4 or 5 sessions, emphasizing interceptive exposure, and still get terrific effect sizes. So that's a really nice real-world example how a treatment that's sort of frozen in time, efficacious, needs to be attended to later on to hone, to carve, to chisel out of that larger block a prettier picture of the true mechanism and a more efficient treatment.
Considering principles at stage 1. Researchers can consider an intervention's principles, their hypotheses of the mechanisms of change, across a variety of stage 1 activities. For example, while creating a brand new intervention, a researcher might design it to operate in accordance with a principle derived from the behavioral science literature. A researcher might try to simplify the intervention by paring it down to its essential ingredients, based upon knowledge of the impact of each ingredient on the outcome. Let's hear from Dr. Donald Edmondson, Associate Professor in the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Director of the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, and from Dr. Edward V. Nunes, Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Irving Medical Center and Research Scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute.
The first stage model project that my group worked on was a behavioral therapy for helping keep patients with obese disorder on naltrexone. I felt like our work, the thing ended up being too complicated, and we really would have needed to simplify it. And so I tend to kind of say to myself now, think about who the end user is going to be when developing an intervention, and when in doubt, keep it simple and think about how would this work in the real world, if you got it that far.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking about how my work in stage 1 is largely trying to feed researchers like you who often play in stage 2 and 3 and even later to help make those decisions about what goes in to an intervention, what's necessary to get there. Make those decisions easier. We're sort of trying to drill down so specifically into these mechanisms and get very good at measuring, because we know that there are clinicians out in the world who want a manualized treatment and who want to know by perhaps giving a self-report questionnaire to a patient before treatment even starts, what are the mechanisms that are at play here? So is this person really anxious about their heart? Okay, then maybe Don Edmondson's treatment is a good treatment for this person. Otherwise, what we do know is that if you just give a traditional PTSD treatment to a cardiac patient without any of the sort of more targeted things with these other mechanisms, you're not going to get very good efficacy. You're not going to get good outcomes there, and that's been shown in meta-analyses and such. But when you do these things, both we can now tailor which patients should receive the treatment, and we know what to expect and how to monitor whether a treatment is working based on these mechanisms.
While adapting an intervention, a researcher might potentiate principles. For example, reinforce features that are essential to an intervention's effects. While developing training materials, a researcher can make sure those materials explicitly state the principles governing the intervention's effects, eliminating the need for providers to rely solely on rote memorization. If automating an intervention, a researcher may ensure that the intervention remains true to its governing principles. Stage 2. Traditional efficacy testing under the most highly controlled conditions possible. Stage 2 description. Stage 2 is efficacy testing. In Stage 2 clinical trials, the person administering the intervention works for the research team, and often the research is conducted in a research setting, such as a research clinic. This approach allows for the highest degree of control or rigor possible in an efficacy trial. Because Stage 2 studies have the highest internal validity possible, it is often the best place to test hypotheses about how the intervention or components of the intervention work. Considering principles in Stage 2. Researchers often consider the highly controlled environment of a Stage 2 efficacy study their best chance to assess principles underlying an intervention because potential confounds are minimized at this stage. While testing the efficacy of an intervention, researchers can text a causal hypothesis about how an intervention works. This testing involves identifying a mechanistic target, measuring the target, testing whether and how the intervention engages the target, and observing whether the change in the target is causally related to a change in the behavior or the clinical outcome. Researchers can use Stage 2 results to identify ways to modify an intervention consistent with its principles, which could happen in a subsequent Stage 1 study to make it even more potent. Stage 3. Efficacy testing of an intervention and of any associated training procedures under highly controlled conditions in the community. Stage 3 is also efficacy testing, but in Stage 3, the person administering the intervention works in the community and the research is conducted in a community setting. It is likely that a Stage 3 study cannot be conducted with as much internal validity as within a Stage 2 study, but the internal validity is maximized to the extent possible in a community context. Stage 3 studies are meant to answer the question, can this intervention work when administered under ideal conditions by community providers and in a community setting? As an efficacy trial that attempts to maximize internal validity, but one that is being conducted in a community setting, as is done in an effectiveness trial, a Stage 3 trial can be considered to be a kind of hybrid stage between efficacy and effectiveness testing. Stage 3 studies can test whether the intervention can work under ideal conditions in the real world and can test how well training procedures for community practitioners are working. Stage 3's emphasis on internal validity makes it ripe for testing principles. In fact, it can be especially important to do this in Stage 3 when a Stage 2 study is not possible. Let's hear from Dr. Sona Demijian.
What is important for the field and where the Stage 3 work, I think, is highly relevant is to investigate, questions in a way that helps to avoid problems that we have seen across multiple interventions where they are studied under tightly controlled, kind of optimized conditions. And then we see a significant drop in terms of the benefit that they provide once they are evaluated in more real world conditions. And I think Stage 3 helps to, in some sense, protect against that, so that as questions of effectiveness and dissemination and implementation are addressed, there's greater confidence in the delivery of the intervention under the conditions that would be more common for the majority of people who would be seeking care. They often involve large studies with large numbers of people and multiple years. And so before one invests the level of resources and energy that is required to do that kind of work well, it is helpful and you might argue necessary to have confidence that the intervention is really ready to be progressed to that point in the research cycle.
Considering principles in Stage 3. Researchers can use a Stage 3 study to test the principles underlying an intervention. In addition, researchers can study principles in several ways. researchers can explore a causal hypothesis about how an intervention works. Researchers can use Stage 3 results to identify ways to modify an intervention, which would happen in a subsequent Stage 1 study so that it can be more easily implemented with fidelity to its principles in the real world. Researchers can also use Stage 3 results to identify ways to modify and improve training materials in a subsequent Stage 1 study to promote fidelity to the principle-driven intervention in real-world settings. Stage 4. Effectiveness testing. Stage 4 is the effectiveness stage when you test whether an intervention can work under natural conditions in the real world. Considering principles at Stage 4. It can be difficult to directly test the principles of an intervention given the real-world complexities of a Stage 4 study. However, consideration of principles is possible in Stage 4. Researchers can sometimes still measure the mechanistic target and see if it is engaged and if clinical outcomes are related to it. Because Stage 4 studies often have large sample sizes, researchers can use their results to observe whether an intervention is particularly effective for subpopulations. Doing so may enable a researcher to form a hypothesis about potential principles explaining their result, which could later be tested in a Stage 2 or 3 study. Let's hear from Dr. Sona Demijian.
One of the potential benefits of the stage model is that the articulation of later phases, so Stage 4 focused on effectiveness or Stage 5 focused on implementation and dissemination, foregrounds the importance of context in the delivery of behavioral interventions and reminds us that behavioral interventions do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in the lived context of people's everyday lives. And so that includes both history and current contemporary systems and structures of oppression that impact both the prevalence of mental health challenges as well as access to resources and systems of care. And so the reminding of the importance of context in those later phases, I think, also can directly inform the kind of work that is done in the earlier phases. So Stage 0 of basic research or Stage 1, and serves as a reminder for people who are working in those stages to not develop interventions or theories about interventions that ignore the context of people's everyday lives.
Although an intervention that is delivered in the real world usually is delivered with some degree of flexibility, a goal of the NIH Stage Model is to determine the boundaries of this flexibility in earlier stages, such that the intervention in Stage 4 remains true to its tested principles. That is, there are no planned modifications to the intervention in Stage 4. Stage 5. Studies to determine successful strategies for implementation and dissemination. Stage 5 is where research on implementation and dissemination occurs. It is where strategies for the successful implementation and dissemination of interventions are developed and tested. Such strategies are typically behavioral interventions in and of themselves. Hence, the development and testing of strategies to promote adoption of interventions can be studied by employing Stages 1 through 4 research within Stage 5 itself. Considering principles at Stage 5. During Stage 5, researchers may consider principles by examining principles that account for successful dissemination and adoption of an intervention throughout an organization or community, and testing hypotheses about the behavioral mechanisms that drive these dissemination and implementation strategies, which are behavioral interventions in their own right. It is important to note here that because dissemination and implementation strategies are interventions, such strategies can be created, adapted, pilot tested, and tested in Stage 1 through 4 research within Stage 5, and principles may be examined accordingly. Flexibility within the NIH Stage Model. The specific decisions researchers make about how to use the NIH Stage Model are open-ended and depend on many factors. These decisions are particularly related to whether an intervention is already known to work, how much is known about how an intervention works, and how complex the intervention is. Depending on these considerations, researchers may proceed through the stages in varying orders, may iterate stages, and may employ a diverse range of methods. For example, a research program could iterate by conducting one Stage 1 study to create and pilot test an intervention, another Stage 1 study to adapt and pilot test it, and yet another to develop and pilot test a training intervention for community providers. The only requirement for determining order is the requirement for the next step or steps to make sense. Let's hear from Dr. Michael W. Otto.
The stage model trains us to be very light on our feet with how we run our career and step through the different parts of our career. Crucially, if we are more of a principle-based researcher, which means we're honing all our efforts toward a mechanism, that makes everything easier for us, because once we become a procedure-based researcher, that we could become aligned to a particular set of interventions in a particular order, we can easily become stodgy and not responsive to what our next set of studies show us. So with the alignment to a sense of my job is to hone a mechanism, a series of principles for engaging that mechanism, it seems much more natural that I may go back and forth to ask different questions to try to keep carving away at my intervention, to keep honing it, sometimes for new populations or new applications, still the same principle, still doing much of the same thing, but changing how the intervention is delivered or the number of interventions necessary to engage the core mechanism.
Let's consider another example. A computer game designed to improve cognitive function might be reliably delivered the same way anywhere it is used. In this case, because no person is delivering the intervention, a Stage 2 study to establish efficacy and a Stage 3 study to establish real-world efficacy will be indistinguishable. For that matter, in cases such as these, a Stage 3 study might be indistinguishable from a Stage 4 study as well. Of course, compelling justifications are always necessary, but it is possible that in this case, a researcher might proceed directly from a pilot Stage 1 study to a Stage 4 effectiveness study. If a computer-based intervention has shown effectiveness in Stage 4 research, the next step may be to conduct Stage 5 implementation research to explore how to encourage individuals or systems to adopt the intervention. Another intervention might not be practically feasible for a Stage 2 study design. For example, if an intervention is designed to support hospitalized patients, it is probably not possible for the study to be conducted outside of a hospital, and it may therefore be necessary for community providers to deliver the intervention. In this case, a researcher might need to proceed directly from Stage 1 to Stage 3. If the intervention requires training, at least 2 Stage 1 studies may be needed. One to create and pilot test the efficacy and the hypothesized mechanism of change of the intervention, and another to create and pilot test real-world training procedures. At any stage, and especially to facilitate successful translation across stages, collaboration may be critical. Many forms of collaboration are possible, and indeed the NIH Stage Model places no constraints on collaboration. For example, basic behavioral and social scientists, intervention developers, and implementation scientists might collaborate to begin turning insights from basic research, called Stage 0 in the NIH Stage Model, into Stage 1 intervention development. Or intervention developers concerned about implementation might collaborate with programmers to harness technology for web-based or gamified interventions. When thinking about what kinds of collaboration might facilitate clinical translation, intervention developers should consider who will be using it. Involving stakeholders can be critical. Let's hear from Dr. Samantha Ferris.
So when I use the stage model, it helps me from the beginning know that I'm developing an intervention that ultimately will be very well defined and very specific. So then if efficacy is demonstrated, I will know and have the knowledge to then inform clinicians at the next stages, whether it's under conditions of effectiveness testing or even implementation. I will know exactly what the intervention is specifically targeting and under what circumstances the intervention could be potentially modified, shortened for efficiency without necessarily affecting its fidelity or its efficacy. I can use an example. I do work in cardiac rehabilitation. This is a really busy type of clinical intervention where patients are coming in multiple times a week. They're working with exercise physiologists, cardiac nurses, and to have a psychologist come in as part of the intervention team, I'm often doing training with the other practitioners in the clinic. And so even though we're doing right now a stage 2 efficacy trial delivered by psychologists, what's really important to me, what I keep in the back of my mind is how will what we're doing be able to be implemented in the future by the interventionists that are always working in that clinic on a regular basis. And so because I know exactly what our intervention is specifically targeting, and I know the exact intervention modality that I'm using to target, then I'll be able to inform interventionists in the future, especially lay practitioners, that if you do this intervention X, it should target behavior Y. And we've tested it under these really specific and narrow circumstances to feel really confident in those outcomes.
Collaborations with providers who administer the intervention can help to make intervention development easier and more efficient. Collaborations with care recipients can help ensure that interventions speak to the needs of the various individuals and communities for whom they are ultimately designed. Capitalizing on lessons learned is crucial. The lessons that a researcher learns at Stage 3 about how well training materials work might lead the researcher to launch Stage 1 work to further refine those materials and improve providers' ability to deliver the intervention with fidelity. The lessons at any stage about how the intervention might be having a differential effect on individuals with different characteristics might lead to a Stage 1 study to understand the principles underlying these differential effects and to personalize an intervention to those with a specific characteristic. Let's hear from Dr. Shanita Hughes-Halbert.
The stage model is important because it guides the questions that are asked at different stages based on the availability and what we know about a particular phenomenon. I think we're just beginning to we're at stage, the very early stages in stress research and within the context of health disparities. And I say that because the questions now that we're answering and are being the focus of research is really trying to understand the ways in which individuals from disparity populations respond to stress under different scenarios, and how those responses to stress under different scenarios are influenced by broader structural issues that include racism and discrimination, where and how they live, or sort of broader social determinants. So we're at the very beginning stages. We're at I think, the first generation of research within the context of stress and health disparities, where we're really trying to understand the nature and distribution of stress responses based on different clinical characteristics, based on geographic variables. So within this broader context of multi-level determinants. And from there, if we say stress is the primary mechanism, we'll understand for whom, there's like a dysregulated stress response, and there may need to be a different intervention that's developed for those individuals versus those who don't have a dysregulated stress response. So that will, and the response to this the data from these first generation studies of stress responses and disparities will lead to the next generation will be, well, how can we intervene the most effectively to enhance stress reactivity? And does that subsequently target that as a mechanism for intervention? How does that impact treatment compliance? How does that impact cancer control behaviors in cancer patients or individuals who have chronic diseases?
A study that disconfirms a hypothesis about the mechanisms of behavior change or the principles of an intervention might lead an investigator to test a different hypothesis in a Stage 0 basic science study or in a Stage 1, 2, or 3 clinical trial. Researchers might also choose to use a variety of research methods, such as N of 1 designs, especially at stages 1, 2, and 3. Experimental medicine approach, especially at stages 1, 2, and 3. Factorial designs, and the multi-phase optimization strategy, MOST, especially at stages 3 and 4. Let's hear again from Dr. Linda M. Collins on factorial designs and MOST.
Tailoring the methods to the research question is really critically important. And I think something that perhaps has been holding back the intervention science field a little bit is that when you think about it, as scientists, we were all trained. One of the first things you learn is that there's no one single experimental design that can address every research question. And yet we've been asking the RCT to address every single research question for about 30 years. And there are lots and lots of other experimental designs that depend. I mean, the RCT, I want to emphasize, is a great experimental design for the kinds of questions it's appropriate for. But there are lots and lots of other research questions that are important in intervention science that the RCT is not really suitable for. There's lots and lots of other experimental designs that are suitable for those kinds of questions. And so I think the NIH Stage Model has laid the groundwork for thinking about these other kinds of experimental designs. So suppose you're interested in developing an intervention. Let's say it's an intervention to get people who are HIV positive but are not engaged in the healthcare system and have not been able to keep their viral load down, engaged in the healthcare system, taking ART properly, and getting their viral load down. And I actually have been involved in a study like that with my colleague, Maria Guadz at NYU. So first, you would start with the preparation phase. You develop a conceptual model, and the conceptual model would specify how people keep their viral load down. What are the factors that lead people to stay in good compliance with antiretroviral therapy? What are the factors that lead people not to stay in good compliance with antiretroviral therapy? And you would identify a set of candidate intervention components. I'm calling them candidate components because there's no guarantee that they're going to end up in the optimized intervention. You're going to test them in the optimization trial to see whether you're going to put them in the optimized intervention. They have to perform well enough in order to get into the optimized intervention. So the candidate components go into the conceptual model, and you specify exactly how these components are expected to affect the process that you're trying to intervene on. Now, in the study that I'm talking about, we were looking at 5 intervention components, and we conducted a factorial experiment. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, a factorial experiment, how could she ever do that? That would take so many experimental participants to power. That is a common misconception about factorial experiments. They actually are very, very efficient in terms of the use of experimental subjects. And I've published on that pretty extensively. You can look at the book that's mentioned here at the bottom of the slide in chapter 3 that is explained, but I've published in a number of places about that. This is why Fisher gave us the factorial experiment and the analysis of variance, because it is a very efficient use of experimental participants. The factorial experiment would have a lot of experimental conditions. And in our case, we used what's called a fractional factorial experiment, which is a special case of the factorial experiment. I won't go into the trade-offs there, but it's fractional factorial experiments are interesting if you're a nerd like me, a design nerd like me. But the fractional factorial experiment enabled us to examine these 5 intervention components using 16 experimental conditions. And yes, it is possible to conduct a 16-condition experiment or even an experiment with more experimental conditions in a difficult field setting. I've been involved in a number of such studies. You have to do it carefully, and it's challenging, but it absolutely can be done. So based on the results, you then get an assessment of the performance of each component and also whether the components interact with each other. And by interaction, I mean, does one component boost the effect of another? Does one component somehow inhibit or decrease the effect of another? Those are the kinds of research questions you can address using a factorial experiment. So how could MOST accelerate the progress from stage 0 to stage 5? Well, for one thing, MOST enables the investigator to look inside the black box and explicitly examine which components are working and which components are not working. And right there, that gives us a sense of how an intervention can be improved. Let me give you an example. If you have a set of intervention components and you go directly to an RCT using the classical treatment package approach, which is currently the state of the art, if the RCT shows that there's a non-significant effect, you don't know what to do next to improve the intervention. You really have very little to go on. However, if you conduct an optimization trial and you know that none of the components worked, you know a lot. You know that none of those components worked, and you know that you need to come up with 5 new components. With a treatment package approach, it's always possible that you had, for example, one component with an iatrogenic effect that was wiping out the effect of several other good components, but you just don't have any way of telling that with the treatment package approach. So that's one way that MOST, I think, can help us progress more quickly through the stage model.
If it addresses the research question at hand, and if it makes sense, no ethical methodology is off limits. Researchers can select whatever methodology is useful for the purpose of developing a principle-driven, potent, and implementable intervention. Now you've heard what the NIH Stage Model is designed to do and how to use it. There are many resources to help you move forward. To get started, read the foundational publication on the NIH Stage Model, Re-envisioning Clinical Science, Unifying the Discipline to Improve the Public Health, and explore the wealth of information on NIA's Division of Behavioral and Social Research NIH Stage Model website. We look forward to seeing how you use the NIH Stage Model to develop potent and implementable interventions that help people in the real world. Let's hear from Dr. Michael W. Otto.
Let me give you what I think are the top 4 reasons why you, the clinical researcher, should be attending to the stage model. Number 1, a focus on mechanism makes you flexible and can help your ultimate dissemination. Helps you not get wedded to a procedure, helps wed you to a principle and a series of mechanisms that let you pivot what your research is like, what disorder, what condition you're focusing on, and helps you make sure that you have a product that is naturally fluid and flexible. So there's lots of ways to get in to get the change you want for the outcomes you want for your patients. That's number 1. 2, it makes sure you attend ontology, what you're measuring and how what you're measuring may be similar to what someone else is measuring, how your language might very naturally be conveyed to someone else's language. There's lots of clubs in the field. There's lots of ways we think about and have preferred ways of thinking about the field and the change process. The more you understand how your mechanism is like others and can be measured and hone the measurement, the more you're able to pull in the broader field and more people to think in terms of a core principle that you think is important. Number 3, team science. It took me forever in my own progression in the field to think about team science. You think about that a little bit earlier, I think, in the stage model, because you may need different professionals and different expertise to move up or down or move across and be iterative in the stage model. And number 4 is iterative is not a bad word. It is actually very cool to be able to hone what you do. And if you're attending to principle, not procedure, some of these shifts don't hurt your feelings. You don't have a single intervention that you fall in love with and by gosh, I'm going to keep that intervention even if it doesn't work as well as I thought. By being, again, focused on mechanism, It helps you be iterative, and iterative can be cool and can help you have a broader impact across the course of your career.